This distinction would not matter because normally you would have a demographic structure like Nigeria. Whoever you have in that 60-something that's about to retire, you're going to have more in their 50s and more in their 40s and so on. It's the same proportion, has been throughout human history, until the global order encouraged industrialization and urbanization at different rates. So every country now has their own demographic profile with imbalances and inequalities among the generations. You all remember the baby boomers, right? They are our largest generation born ever, and they are nearing retirement. In fact, on average, they retire at the end of the year, which means all of their savings are about to be converted. Because the day you retire, you cash in your stocks and your bonds and you go into greenbacks and T-bills. Because if there's a currency crash or a market crash, you will never recover. You no longer have new income to take advantage of or recover from some shocks. So you go from having the largest, most liquid, highest velocity investments of your life to a glacier overnight. And for the baby boomers, on average, that happens at the end of the year. The next generation down is my generation, Gen X, and there are not enough of us. So we know we're facing a capital crash, global in scope, next year. It's just damn inconvenient that it's happening at the same time that the business cycle is turning as well. Probably means that people will blame the business cycle rather than demographic underpinnings. We also have a labor problem. Boomers were the largest generation ever. That means they're also the largest part of the workforce. And something interesting happened to the boomers. When they all entered the workforce in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, there were so many of them, they pushed down the cost of labor. They competed themselves out of jobs. Got so bad that a lot of boomer families decided that the second spouse had to enter the workforce as well, which only made it worse. That's one of the reasons, the financial pressure of that, why the baby boomers have the highest divorce rate in history. Now, my generation looks at that like, there's so many things about the baby boomers that are just stupid, and we're certainly not following in their footsteps for that one. For us, our time is at least as important as our money. So whereas the boomers have the highest labor participation rate ever, we have the lowest, and we're proud of it. For the last 20 years, that has absolutely worked against us, because you've got like 4 Xers for 15 billion boomers, and we got lost in the noise. We were the low men on the totem pole. We were interns for longer than any generation before, and we had the lowest raises for any generation up till now. But now that the baby boomers are leaving, it's our time. Because all of these top-level jobs across the entire system are becoming available at the same time. And even if we all wanted to work, and we do not, there would not be enough of us to fill all the spots. So we are now enjoying the highest raises in human history, or American history, and we have at least another 12 years to go with that. We call this labor inflation, folks. It's not Biden, it's not Trump, it's just our population structure. It's the single biggest reason why we were facing high inflation right now. There are others, of course. I don't mean to suggest that the presidents are scot-free on this one, but the monetary policy, the debt spending, that's like number 7 on the list as far as I'm concerned. This is number 1. Number 1B are the Zoomers. They're the smallest generation we've ever had. And they are, what's the best way to phrase this? They're not millennials. Millennials, we know. They're collaborative, they're cooperative, they're social, they're good at management. All these things are true. Positive stereotypes backed up by data. That is not the Zoomers. Well, the millennials were raised by the baby boomers to be told they're special. It's part of the reason why they're so affable most of the time. The Zoomers were raised by my generation. So we told them growing up that you will never have Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid. You are on your own. You will always be outnumbered. You will never have a president, because the millennials, like the boomers, will always outvote you. You have to be better than everyone all the time if you want to get by. You can't rely on anyone. That has made them the most antisocial generation ever, the most medicated generation ever. And their dream job is to be locked in a closet in the dark coding. They are incredibly loyal workers. If you give them a job, they will try to stay with you for their entire lives. but they never want to meet you. I mean, people talk about mental health and COVID and being locked up. This has been the best 2 years in the Zoomers' lives, and they're the smallest generation we've ever had. So we've got the baby boomers at the top that are leaving, the largest generation we've ever had. We're replacing them with the smallest one ever. This year, we have a shortage of 400,000 workers just because of that swap. That number will increase every year until at least 2034, where it will probably top out at about 900,000 shortage a year. That's the scale of this phase of our labor shortages. There's another one, because then we've got the millennials. Now, we've all heard the positive ones. Let's talk about the negative, because they're true too, totally backed up by data. Narcissistic, obsessive, lazy, entitled, first job at 27, mom still drives them to work. Backed up by data, all true for half of them. For the other half have always done everything we demanded of them. They graduated from school in 3.5 years. They didn't go to Europe for a couple of years to find themselves. They went straight into the workforce. And because of it, they were absolutely screwed, because they were the last ones in when the financial crisis happened. So they were the first ones kicked out. So whether it's because the millennials did everything right or wrong, they lost out on 3 to 5 years of formative work experience in their 20s. They will never get that back. They will always be behind until they retire. They're the least skilled generation we have ever had for their age bracket. The hope for the labor market is not with the millennials. It's with the millennials' kids. The millennials, like the boomers, are a large generation, and a large generation generates a large generation. So we just have to wait for the millennials' children to grow up to enter the workforce. On average, that will not happen until 2045. We have labor inflation until then. So if you want to hire, don't wait 3 months or 9 months or 90 months. Do it now. It won't get better for a long time. The United States is the only country with a millennial generation, which means the United States is really the only country with a consumption base right now. The United States is the only country with a consumption base right now. We're the only ones with a millennial generation. The one thing that makes American baby boomers unique, the one thing, there's only one, they had kids. The world's other boomers didn't. So do we give the millennials a lot of crap? Yeah. Do they deserve it? Oh yeah. But they exist. They actually are special. These are the 4 largest economies in the world. Japan hit population of no return, age of no return, definite demographic death in the 90s. Europe hit it in the 2000s. China's a special case. Now, if you ignore these yellow bars and just assume they're red, that was the demographic structure that the Chinese presented in January of 2000. At that point, they were already the fastest aging labor force in the world. One-child policy. 40 years later, you have a problem. It's 40 years later. Anyone tells you that the Chinese are good at math, they are lying. What has happened since January of 2000 is that the Chinese have completed their 10-year census. Because of COVID, it took them a little bit longer to collate everything, so it hasn't been fully released yet, but they have been letting bits and pieces of it out. And they're now grudgingly, publicly admitting that they overcounted their population by in excess of 100 million people, all of whom would have been born since one child, so people aged 40 and under, and most of whom would have been women, because selective sex abortions within China are very popular. If that's true, those yellow bars don't exist. Remember, they were the fastest aging before. This means that the Chinese economic model is already dead. This means that the Chinese population peaked back in the mid-2000s. And this means that China will have less than half its population that it has currently by 2050. China will die this decade. Demographics will guarantee it. They just don't have enough people to even theoretically rebuild their population at this point. What's going with Russia, with Ukraine, with energy, and with Xi can speed that up. If you are dependent upon parts from China, what are you waiting for? Shanghai was shut down for 2 months. I mean, what more signals do you need that they're no longer a reliable producer and participant in international supply chains? And that's before it gets really scary. Now, in the United States, we have an option that most other countries don't. We have Mexicans. They have been our partners in the labor force in the production cycle for 40 years. They have one of the healthiest demographies in the world, by far the healthiest in the advanced developing world. This is great. Now, it's not perfect. As you can see, it kind of goes straight down from here. The tequila crisis hit the Mexicans in 1995, kind of a combination of our S&L crisis and our subprime crisis in one. They had to get a US bailout to recover. And they decided they never wanted to be in that position again, so they started to diversify their economy into manufacturing using this crazy, crazy Canadian idea called NAFTA. And they haven't had to face anything like that again. But it also means that they started moving off the farm and into the cities, and the birth rates halved. Now, this is not a terminal demography. They can coast on this a very long time, but it does mean that the peak supply of Mexican labor to the American market has already passed, and Mexican net migration to the US has now been negative for 12 of the last 13 years. It'll probably never be positive again. So we need to start thinking of Mexican labor in a way that we never have before, as a precious resource to be applied sparingly.